Okay. So today we are starting a new unit, which is web-based development. So today we're going to understand the client side and the server side technologies. So what we're doing today, we're going to analyze what is a full stack development and what are the requirements for us to learn and the things we need to understand in order for us to become agile and able to work with the front end and back end. So what the learner will do today, the learner will develop an understanding of web-based development. They will reach different technologies that can be used to create dynamic and interactive websites, and they will use this research to develop their own website. So what will happen? Let me just pause 1 second. So in today's session, we're going to look into front-end development and back-end development, and we're going to look into the technologies that will allow us to develop and work with these frameworks. So what the learner is going to learn today is going to learn how to develop an understanding of web-based development. So the learner will also reach different technologies that can be used to create dynamic and interactive website, and they will use these to develop their own website. So also once we have looked into a full stack development with front end, back end, and APIs, we're also going to look into investigating how e-commerce and SEO techniques are used to promote website, and they will now suggest appropriate techniques to solve a business problem. So the learner will create a backend database to allow the database to interact with the website, and also they will critically review the web-based solution against client's requirement. So we mean for client server side. So a client server side is simply a front end, is simply a framework which allows us to have an interaction between human and the computer. So whenever you're working with any type of software application which can be on the web or installed on your machine, you will now work with a front end. So this will allow you to give some input, will allow you to give some data, and what the front end does is simply going to capture this data that you've been provided and now move it into the back end, which will now execute what you intend to and you're required to do. So the main goal of a front end is to be user friendly. It is to allow our human to have the best experience while working with this application. Therefore, front end work really close with user interface and user experience, which are both where with the combination of both, we're now able to make our application as user friendly as possible in order for us to obtain more customers and increase the revenues. So the client server side is mainly the combination of different technology. So as far as we know, HTML and CSS are the fundamentals which allows us to build web pages, which could be static web page or dynamic web pages. And in order for us to have a response to, we now need to use JavaScript. So JavaScript allows us to, it is basically the behavior, is how our website should respond. So whenever you input, you type your password and you receive a message back, that all this is being done through JavaScript, which simply coordinate the behavior of our website. So as the definition says, client-server model is distributed application structure that for the participation, task, or workload between the provider of a resource or service called server and the service request called client. So what happens is that between client side and server side, there is a protocol. So most of the most famous protocol is HTTP, which is Hypertext Transfer Protocol, and is simply a protocol where there's an exchange of request and response between our client server and our backend. So by you as a user giving a request, you now receive a response which will come from our backend or from data retrieved from our database. The most famous browsers that we can find out there can be Internet Explorer, where Microsoft built this very user-friendly web browser, which allows us to search, and as a searching engine, it allows us to find as much as data that we need to find. Also, there is Google, which is another big company, which allows us to browse and find as much as information as we want on the internet. And also we do have other browsers, but they're not as famous as they're not as used as Google and Internet Explorer. So these are Safari, Firefox. Back in the days, there was something called Opera, which I think now is owned by Firefox. And also we have Brave, which is a really good web browser with a built-in VPN. Also, as mentioned before, the technology that sits on our front end are HTML, CSS. If you want to make your design really cool, you can use Bootstrap, and finally JavaScript. So by having a good knowledge of this stack, you can easily work as a front-end developer, and there are loads of job opportunity with when it comes to front-end developers. So HTML is not really a programming language because it doesn't interact, it doesn't work as JavaScript. So it's simply the combination of tags where you have opening and closing tags, and within these tags you can give informations which allows you to have some response from your static web page. So HTML is a markup language, and it is simply used to create web pages and web application where we can now build blocks onto our web page. And into these blocks, we can add text, images, or links, which will now allows us to fetch or retrieve data from other web pages. CSS, which is a cascading style sheet. It is mainly used as a layout, and it allows us to give a cool design to our web page, which is not anymore just plain text and images, but it can now have a really nice design through CSS. And lastly, we now have JavaScript, which is the actual programming language that sits at the back of HTML and CSS. And it is basically allows us to manipulate, we can calculate, manipulate, and validate data. Also, there are other type of frameworks which are really useful. So we have things such as Ajax, which can refer to the collection of standard-based and open source browser technologies. Also, we have other type of frameworks, which allows us to make our web page as dynamic as possible. So the most famous as of now, I would say they are React, Vue, and Angular, which allows us to create components. So by creating components, we now make our web pages our web application as much as dynamic as possible, and it allows us to have very responsive applications. Also, when it comes to server side, we have Node.js, which allows us to work with the server and able to do many things. So we do have loads of example here of server-side frameworks, technology. So we have Ruby, Django, and so on. And also we have a 20% of all websites run on these frameworks, such as Drupal, .NET, which is a full stack framework built by Microsoft, and is also made with the C# programming language, AngularJS, Ember.js, and Backbone.js, which are all sitting on JavaScript framework. So let's look into the difference between dynamic and static website. So what do we mean by dynamic? By dynamic, we just simply have the ability to interact with the website through a HTTP hypertext transfer protocol, where we can request and receive information, as I mentioned before, between our front end and our server side. So as we mentioned before, Node.js is one of the popular frameworks which are used to work with backend. So due to the fact that JavaScript runs on the browser, we're not able to do we're not able to work on backend due to this limitation. That's why Node.js plays a really important role, where we have the ability to connect our front end with our back end through this framework, and they normally run through. We normally install the package, and we can now run it on our IDE. So normally we'll be using something like Visual Studio Code, which will work as a runtime environment and will allow us to perform our code. Another important, famous, popular one is PHP, which is mainly, I think, is just used for backend as a server side, and it's just above 80% of websites are running on PHP. So when it comes to backend, PHP, I'll say, is one of the most used server side. So this is used for WordPress platform, which powers 25% of website in today's world. Then we have Java, which is another popular language, and it is used for the major website, and it is used in many large enterprise application like banks and insurance companies. So when it comes to Java, we know that it is used mainly for industrial purposes and for large corporate organizations. Ruby is largely popular for small application and is also suitable for rapid web development. Python is, I think, it is as famous as JavaScript, and it is one of the best because it's very flexible, and it works with an interpreter, which allows us to run easy code, which will now be understood by the programming language. So Python is also used mainly for web application and also data science. So what is web service or a service-oriented architecture? So we all know there are protocols that has to be followed in order for us to deliver some excellent and functional application. That's why we need to look into the architecture to understand how this can be done and run effectively. Service-oriented architecture, SOA, is simply a style where we will now build using SOA style to deliver functionality as a service, and it also can be used to reuse when building application or integrating new frameworks to our application. So what is a service? So by service, it is simply reusable component that can be used in building blocks for more larger and more complex business application functionalities. What are the characteristics for this service? The main characteristics are going to support open standard for integration, loose coupling, and stateless and location independent. So these are the main key areas that we need to know when we're working with a web service. So now we're going to look into the introduction to web service, whereby we're going to see that these are open standard, XML, SOAP, HTTP, etc. And these are all web-based applications that will interact with other web applications for the purpose of exchanging data. And all this happens through APIs, which are application programming interface, where allows us to connect one server to another through these apps. Of components for a web service, where with a basic web service platform is XML and HTTP, and both of them will work using the following component. They will must have a architecture or a simple object access protocol, a UDDI, Universal Description Discovery and Integration, and a WS WSDL, which stands for Web Service Description Language. What is the role of a web service? There are three major roles when it comes to defining a web architecture. So it is going to be a service provider, a service request, and a service registry. So as we mentioned before, you will now have to work with a request and response protocol. And also when it comes to registry, it is going to locally store relevant data that we've been given from the user. When it comes to web service description language, it is an XML format for describing all information needed to invoke and communicate with a web service. So with a functional, you will now have a functional and a non-functional description, where with the functional, we're going to define the details of how a web service is invoked, where it is invoked. While with the non-functional, you now provide other details that are secondary to the message. So these are stuff such as security policy. The resource description framework, it is a general framework for how to describe any internet source such as website and its content. With RDF is a framework for describing resource on the web, basically. XML, where is simply it is a file extension for extensible markup language. So with XML, it is a markup language, basically like HTML. So when it comes to building a website, we always need to work with a agile methodology, which will allow us to deliver our website. So there are stages that has to be followed. So these are related to our system development lifecycle, where we have stages like planning, design, coding, testing, and maintaining. And this will allow us to deliver our full website. Also, we have database design, where we now have to choose a database which will allow us to store our data and able to manipulate this data. So now, when it comes to databases, there are different types. There are SQL and non-SQL. By SQL, I mean structured query language, and non-SQL we use databases like MongoDB, which are non-relational databases. So this part of will be covered in the next tutorial. So is there any question for me?
There's no question.
Okay, so if there is no question, I will end up today's session. And thank you for joining, and I'll see you tomorrow.